to my storytelling channel, whether you're watching on YouTube or my Facebook page or some other way. And welcome back if you've been there before. On April the 2nd, I decided to post my Ragman and Luke's stories of hope as a gift to people this Easter in these difficult days. Those stories were due to be performed as part of the Warrnambool Easter Arts Festival. Because of the positive response I had to those stories, I undertook to post a story a week. This week is the 6th of these stories. But interest has been dwindling. I understand that people have many other things to watch, or there may be other reasons for this. So I've decided to stop posting weekly stories, but because I want to keep my YouTube Liebelt channel open, I will be posting a new story each month on the first weekend of the month. Today's story is another one that I have written. It's the backstory of Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector of Jericho. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you sincerely for your support in the past weeks. Please enjoy this story, and I hope that you can continue to watch my stories in the coming months. There are 3 types or groups of people in the world. Those that can count and those who can't. Pause while people process that statement. Seriously though, there are 2 things that are certain in life: death and taxes. Someone more important than I, Zacchaeus, will say that one day and be remembered for it. We Jews certainly know about taxes. Taxes seem to have been around forever. The ancient Romans had taxes. The Egyptians had their grain taxed in preparation for the 7 years of famine, which helped to feed my ancestors Joseph and his family. Years later, other foreign countries would invade our country, control us, and tax us. The Persians, the Greeks, and the God-forsaken Romans. Now you might wonder why I know so much about taxes. Well, I pay them and I collected them. For years I was the chief tax collector in Jericho. But I want to tell you that there's one other thing that's certain in life. But first, let me tell you my story. It's a story of death and taxes. It's a story of pain and suffering. But it ends in joy and freedom. Under the Romans, we have been harshly taxed. Oh, they have built great roads and bridges, canals, but it seems as though they've built these only to collect a toll. Can you imagine that? Having to pay a toll or a tax to use a public road? And our King Herod had a tax too on all produce. Everything that was bought and sold. Can you imagine that? A tax on what you buy and sell? Goods and services? So, we had a land tax payable in money or kind. We had a tax on personal property, export and import tariffs paid at the seaports and the city gates. And then in Jerusalem, they had a house tax. And did I mention the temple tax? Those going to the temple had to pay their offering with a particular currency. And so they would be charged exorbitant amounts to have their money exchanged to the right currency. Over 30 years ago, Roman Emperor Augustus it was, ordered a census to be taken throughout the country and required people to go back to their hometown to be registered for their taxes. We lived in Capernaum in those days, but we had to go back to Jericho, where our family had come from. And I ended up staying there. So you can imagine collecting all these taxes was a major exercise. And I guess that's where I come in. I was a dumpy little kid, not very tall and not very strong. I couldn't do a lot of hard labour jobs, and I couldn't join the army because of that. So I was fortunate to get an education. I learnt languages. I learnt to read and write, and not very many people had that privilege. I enjoyed learning facts and keeping records. I was good at it. I knew every person's name and where they lived. You name it, I had it up here. Well, for all that education, it didn't do me much good. I was never going to be a rabbi or a teacher, and as I said before, I wasn't strong enough to do physical jobs. Finally, my family paid me and some money and sent me away. I was determined to become rich and to prove to them that I could make something of my life. But that led to me making the biggest mistake in my life. Oh, that I could undo that decision and all the years that followed. Because you see, I used that money to bid at auction for the right to collect taxes. My education made me ideally suited for that sort of work. From there, I later became a chief tax collector in charge of all tax collectors in Jericho. But I was rejected by my own people and as hated as the Romans who employed me. The richer I became, the poorer in spirit I was. Tax officers are never popular anywhere because no one likes paying taxes, I guess. This is no doubt the case in free countries as it was in our occupied one, but under Roman rule we tax collectors were especially despised and degraded. My people hated the domination they were under, even though the Romans, as I said before, brought good like roads and bridges. We were oppressed under military rule. Of that we were reminded every day as we saw soldiers in the street. We looked forward to freedom, and some revolutionary groups took opportunities to attack the regime in any way that they could. Some would call these acts of terrorism, but certainly of revolution. Because the Romans were a pagan nation, those most opposed to them considered this, believed that any act of submission, like paying taxes, was an act against Yahweh himself. More respectable leaders didn't go so far, but looked on the taxes as an imposition by a foreign controlling government, and not in order to maintain social justice and order in the country. What's more, the amounts that were charged were excessive, making both Roman officials and tax collectors rich. I did not anticipate what would happen by being employed by the Romans. Would make me such an outcast of society. I'd sold myself into the service of these foreign occupiers against my own people, who then identified me as being one of them. I was neither Jew nor Roman. I might as well have been a slave. this constant contact with foreigners also made me unclean. So I was rejected in another way. And the demands of the contract that I was committed to meant that I took more and more than I should have. I stole from the people. This became a vicious circle, and with the support and encouragement of the Romans, I became very rich. But money can't buy you happiness. Furthermore, my position made me so despised that I was disqualified from any other public office. I couldn't witness in court. I couldn't attend the synagogue. My work often required me to work and break the Sabbath law. My family was tarnished because of who I was, and in turn rejected me. Tax collectors were considered in the same way as murderers and robbers and money changers, prostitutes and adulterers, none of whom were considered very highly in my culture or community. I couldn't even use my money for good, for it was tarnished. To touch the wealth which was received unlawfully was to share the guilt of that person. And it gets worse. I couldn't get out. If I'd given it up, I had no possibility of being able to do or get any other job. Despite my education and the experience I'd gained working with money and records, murderer doesn't get too many job interviews either. In my loneliness and remorse, I sunk deeper and deeper into despair, depression. My life was surrounded with the finest possessions, but I would gladly have exchanged them for a happier life and for some friends. Then I heard a story that raised new hope for me. I told you before that I was originally from Capernaum. I kept contact with a few acquaintances up there who would acknowledge me. Also, we tax collectors stuck together. We had to. We were all in the same boat, like a colony of lepers. Well, a tax collector named Levi told me how a rabbi came up to him at his tax booth one day and invited him to follow him. Immediately he felt a sense of release, a way out of the predicament that I also was in. The rabbi treated Levi as a real person, not as an outcast, and valued his presence and hospitality. His name was Jesus, and Levi became one of his students. No, more than that, a disciple. Levi spoke in terms of Jesus being the Messiah. This I had trouble believing, but I hung out for the next instalments of Levi's stories, because he was clearly getting a love and acceptance that we were not used to, and yet all of us desired. For example, the day that Jesus called Levi invited him to a meal with some of his friends and Jesus' other followers. You understand from what I've said who Levi's friends would be. Apparently, some Pharisees got wind of this dinner and turned up. Meals in our culture are open to the general community. They were indignant that such a supposedly good and religious leader, teacher, was eating with such outcasts. And Levi told how Jesus turned a common proverb into a special word. He said, those who are sick need a doctor, not those who are well. I came to call not the righteous, but sinners to repentance. In all the confusion and sadness of my life, this gave me a glimpse of hope. If only I knew what to do with it. Well, stories from Levi came too few and far apart as he travelled the country with this Jesus. What was clear was that this man didn't treat outcasts like dirt. What was clear was that he wanted people to change. He wanted to spend quality time with them. He ate with them, and in our community, that means you want to get to know them. And that's exactly what Jesus was doing, according to Levi. The recognition of my life, my remorse, even led me to go to the temple in Jerusalem when I was there on business. Because I am unclean, I was not able to go into the altar area. went at the time for prayers and sacrifice to be put right with God. We call it atonement. I could just stand with my head bowed, beating my breast and wailing for mercy from God. I went home not believing that it was possible that I could ever receive that forgiveness. I saw and heard in the temple area a Pharisee. He stood before God and he prayed so loud that I could hear him outside. God, Yahweh, I thank you that I'm not like other men. And he listed off a number of undesirable groups and even pointed towards me. I fast twice a week, he said, when only once was required by the law. And I tithe of everything I receive, more than was required. And even in his boastfulness, his arrogance, his judgment, mentalism, I wondered if he went home right with God rather than me. Well, Yahweh heard my prayer and answered it, but not in the way that I expected him to. And I've discovered since that that's the way he works. One day I was going to one of my tax booths and I saw a large crowd gathering in the street. And I overheard that Jesus was coming to Jericho. I just wanted to see who he was. But you will have realized that I am no one's friend, and being short I could not see over the crowd, and nor was anyone about to let me through. There were just taunts of, "What's he doing here?" So I did the first thing that came into my head. I climbed a sycamore tree. I wanted to see Jesus, believing that that would lift my spirits as being in the presence of good and famous men often does. I didn't realize how difficult it would be to climb the tree in my robes, or how undignified it probably looked. But when I got up there, the first person I saw in his group was my friend Levi. And immediately I knew that I'd done the right thing. But, to my surprise, Jesus came right up to my tree, looked straight in my eye, and called me by name. Zacchaeus, hurry down. I must stay at your house today. Well, I nearly fell out of a tree, but I scrambled down in one piece, and I was pleased to welcome him. The people in the crowd weren't so pleased. One audible jibe said, "He's gone to be the guest of one who's a sinner." Now you need to understand that Jesus calls us to change. He wants us to be clean. By coming to my house, he would be ceremonially unclean. So I needed to act before then. And so I promised. I will sell half my possessions and give the money to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will repay them 4 times as much. The law requires that repentance be accompanied by retribution. And Jesus called me the most beautiful name. He called me son of Abraham. In so doing, he acknowledged that I too was a member of God's people under God's covenant, that I was accepted. And he told me that I was saved. And he also said to me, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. I knew at that time God's Spirit, Yahweh's Spirit, had spoken to my spirit. Well, what happened after that? I didn't know, but learnt later that from Jericho Jesus went to Jerusalem, and there he was arrested, accused of all kinds of false accusations. I don't doubt that one of the reasons that the religious leaders didn't like him was because he spent quality time with people like me. He was executed. But on the third day, he rose again. Apparently he'd told his followers that he would rise again, but I don't think they had understood that. I certainly wouldn't have. But I now know that he is the Messiah. And now I've sold the rest of my possessions. I'm going up to Galilee. He told his followers, many more now than the 12, which became 11 after Judas betrayed him. He told them to gather in Galilee. And I'm going there now to be with them, to learn more about this love of Yahweh for outcasts, even like me. You see, there's 3 things certain in life: death and taxes and the great love of God. I know that because it has set me free, and I know that I